everybody. I'm John Kalaki from the Flynn Center. I want to welcome you here. RETN is live streaming it, so that's why I have this mic in this small room. Otherwise, I would just be saying hello like this. That would work with you on the live stream. I'm really happy and very proud to work with Vermont Digger. I think all of us in this room are big fans of Vermont Digger, and it is just ever more essential every day in our world that we have Vermont Digger. So thank you, Ann Galloway, and your entire staff for making journalism real. It's so important. Last year we hosted with them a whole symposium on fake news, and it seemed even it seemed a little abstract last year. But I'm glad Digger was there already talking about it with all of us. And what I love about this is I did reach out to Ann and said, you know, we have this incredible Phish exhibition here in the gallery, and I'd love for people to see it. And what's kind of fun about it is 20 years ago, the band Phish had a concert at the Flynn Center here and established their Waterwheel Foundation, which is their philanthropic wing. And the Waterwheel Foundation has been very involved in water and cleanup issues for the band. So we thought it was kind of fun with that. So to orient you, these are the early handbills from when the band first started. And that very first one says Phish, a band, because people didn't know Phish was a band. And it was at Nectar's in 1984, and it cost $1. Okay? So that was the earliest handbill we could get from the archives. The band played 1 year earlier, apparently on December 1st, but that's just about the earliest. And then in the hallway, we have Ben and Jerry's used to have a little diary in each of their scoop shops back then. And we actually have the diary entry where someone said, oh, and if you're not busy after work tonight, you should go to Nectar to see some friends of mine. They're in a band called Phish. And it was that 1984 concert. And of course, Ben and Jerry's had Phish food as well. And that was established 20 years ago, again, for the Waterwheel Foundation. So these are the early handbills. Then these over here, Jim Pollock is one of their artists, and these are all things that Phish sells at their Madison Square Garden and other tour dates, and it all goes to support Waterwheel. And then on this wall, we organized it around, well, regional concerts that Phish did that you had sort of the hope that you could actually get back to Burlington by daylight. So we call the whole thing Phish in the North Country, and so many of you have been at probably these, but Saratoga Springs, Connecticut, Boston. Anyway, and these were from the Flynn concert 20 years ago. So it's really kind of fun to celebrate Phish, and also that their commitment is to the water, that it just seemed, to me, perfect that we were doing this. So I'm glad you're all here, and I'm really glad you're all here to talk about this future. So I'm going to turn over to Teresa, and I'm going to sit by the coffee and the cookies and probably eat cookies the whole time. So come on over, get this mic for me, please. All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
So welcome everybody. My name is Teresa Marie Clausen. I'm the Director of Underwriting at VTDigger. And thank you so much for coming out tonight on a Thursday night. We hope that you learn a lot. Events are a cornerstone of VTDigger's mission, which is to engage the public in civic discourse. We obviously do that every time you open up your email in the morning and you open up the Daily Digger, or you navigate to VTDigger's site. That's engaging you in civic discourse as well. But this is a way to do it face-to-face and personally. And we think that these event series are really important. So we're really appreciative of you coming out. We hope you have a good time. We hope you walk away learning something. We hope the panel walks away learning something too from you, because there's a Q&A with the audience at the end. You should know that with our partners, RETN, we are Facebook living this. If living is a verb, I don't probably, if there are any English teachers in the audience, I'm going to get slaughtered. This probably is a verb, but we are streaming this Facebook Live. So we'll take a couple of questions at the end in the Q&A from actually our Facebook Live audience. But most of the questions will come from you. So the way we're going to structure this evening is Ann is going to moderate, Ann Galloway. I'm going to talk about Ann in a second. And she will moderate a series of questions. The panelists will have an opportunity, 5 minutes each, to give you their perspective on cleaning up Lake Champlain and how we're going to pay for it. I don't know how they're going to do that in 5 minutes, but they're going to give it a try. And then there'll be a Q&A and a conversation between the panelists and Ann. And at that point, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. And the way we're going to do that is because it's a small space, I'll be in the back of the room with this mic for people who want to ask questions in the back. And for people who are in the front of the room, maybe like the third or fourth row up, you can come up to the stand, the mic stand here, and ask your question. We ask that your questions be relatively brief, so not spending 2 minutes up at the mic, but maybe 30 seconds so that people have an opportunity. We get in as many questions as we possibly can, because each of the panelists is going to have an opportunity to answer that question. Okay, fair enough? Those are the rules. Okay, a little bit about VTDigger. This woman right here. So the joke is, back in 2009, when Ann Galloway founded VTDigger, they were about 2 readers, and tonight it'll be Ann and John Kalaki, probably the 2 readers who were reading Digger back in 2009. 2017, we have over 200,000 monthly readers. We have about 10,000 people coming to the site every day. And many of you, I think pretty much everybody in this room is one of the 10,000 that's coming every day, or the 200,000 every month. So we are incredibly grateful for your support. You make Digger what it is. If it wasn't for the 10,000 of you every day and the 200,000 of you every month, I wouldn't be standing up here, and Ann wouldn't be sitting here, and these people wouldn't be sitting here. So we're really incredibly grateful for the support of our membership. We are in the middle. If you probably haven't noticed, all of those drop-downs, fly-ins, emails, we're in the middle of an annual fund drive. We have to raise $350,000. We're about halfway there. So we're pretty psyched about that. And right now, if you donate $20 a month, you're going to get that beautiful Sabre Field book. That's the end of the commercial. So if you like what you hear tonight and you walk away thinking journalism is alive and well in the state of Vermont, please consider donating to us. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Ann Galloway, who will introduce our panelists. And again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy yourself. Oh, I think you can use that.
Oh, gosh, I have my own.
I have to thank our sponsors. Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
you do.
Thank you. I have to thank our sponsors very briefly. So RETN, Channel 16, has been a terrific partner for us. We do partner with our public access stations all over the state when we do events like this, and they are absolutely fabulous to work with. They will be broadcasting this later on this week, and I have a clipboard. If you want to get the link to this event tonight, which is being recorded, you can sign up on this clipboard, and then we're going to put it right over there before you leave, and Retton will be sure to send you the link. The other sponsors for this evening, you've probably had a little bit of it, maybe some of you, is Vermont Coffee Company. Vermont Coffee Company has been with us almost right from the very beginning in underwriting support, so we're really grateful for them. The Flynn, of course, wonderful partner for us in any space we ask. They're terrific. And Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, VSAC, another staunch and steadfast supporter of VTDigger, also right from the very beginning. So, and a brand new underwriter, Bohemian Bakery. If you're ever in Montpelier on Berry Street, stop by. What a place that is. And they are Digger readers, and they gave us a call and they said, we would really like to help you. And so they are responsible for all those cookies that you see in the back, Little Bohemian Bakery. So there you go. Everybody from VSAC all the way down to Bohemian Bakery reading Digger. So again, here's Ann Galloway, and enjoy.
You're taking that one. So I committed a party foul when I came in here. I forgot to turn my cell phone off. So I'm going to do that. And if anybody else wants to do the same thing, now's a good time to do that. Oh, because that would just be awful, wouldn't it? Oh, okay, that's better. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, John Kalaki, for hosting tonight. I'm really delighted that you've lent us the space. And I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists, and we're hoping to make this a very lively discussion. But I'm going to read their bios, if I can find them here, because we have a very esteemed panel. Starting to my left, we have Chris Killian, who is the Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation Vermont. He is also the Director of Clean Water and Healthy Forests. Prior to his work at CLF, Chris spent 8 years with the Vermont Natural Resources Council. Chris's admissions include State of Vermont, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and Federal District Court for the District of Vermont. Chris received his BA in Political Science from the University of Rochester and his law degree and master's in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School. In the middle, we have Julie Moore. Julie Moore is the Secretary of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the state agency with primary responsibility for protecting and sustaining Vermont's environment, natural resources, wildlife, forests, and state parks. Before her appointment, Moore worked as the Water Resources Group Leader at Stone Environmental, an environmental consulting firm in Montpelier. Prior to joining Stone, Moore spent 7 years at A&R, where she led the state's efforts to reduce phosphorus pollution in Lake Champlain. Moore has volunteered for several organizations dedicated to improving Vermont's water resources, including Friends of Northern Lake Champlain Advisory Council, Friends of the Winooski River, and Watersheds United, the Winooski Water Natural Resources Conservation District, and the Citizens Advisory Committee on the Future of Lake Champlain. Moore has a BS in Civil Engineering and an MS in Environmental Science and Policy. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. All right, great. David Mears, who is the furthest over here to the left, to my left, is the Director of the Environmental Law Center and the Associate Dean for Environmental Law Programs at Vermont Law School. Prior to his current position at VLS, Mears served 4 years as Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Mears has held a number of positions in state and federal government, including positions in Texas as Enforcement Coordinator in the Texas Water Commission, Assistant Attorney General in the Texas Office of Attorney General, and Senior Attorney for Water Quality with the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission. He has served as the Energy and Environmental Policy Director with the Texas Office of State-Federal Relations in Washington, D.C., as a trial attorney and counselor for state and local affairs with the U.S. Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division, and as a Senior Assistant Attorney General and Chief of the Ecology Division in the Washington Office of the Attorney General. David Mears has a BS in Environmental Engineering Technology from Cornell University and a Juris Doctor and Masters of Environmental Law and Policy degrees from Vermont Law School. So each one of the panelists is going to have 5 minutes to talk about the topic tonight, which is who pays for Lake Champlain cleanup. And we will start in reverse order with David and work our way toward me. And then after that, I'll ask some questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions. David?
Thank you, Ann, and thanks to VTDigger for this. And I'd like to make a quick plug for VTDigger in the sense that I was in a conversation earlier tonight, and someone said, "How come I don't know about X, Y, and Z that we were talking about?" And I fear that there has been, I've seen over my career, I think you all can probably attest to this, and you may have your own perspective on it, but over the period of 30 or so years that I've been working in the environmental field, I have seen a steady decline in the role of journalism, and in particular in the role of investigative journalism. To get at the complex environmental issues, to kind of have a common public understanding of those issues requires reporters that spend more than, just a few months on the beat learning the issues. They're deep, complicated issues, and they require reporters that have developed expertise, and none of the major media outlets have been able to retain that over time, for whatever reasons. But the net effect is, I think, that an increase in the level of misunderstanding and miscommunication and misinformation. So I'm deeply grateful that VTDigger is spending the time and resources with the support of the broader public to try to address that. So thank you for this opportunity, for this venue. I have to admit that I was grumpy on my way up here. I was coming from South Royalton, and I thought I had escaped a faculty meeting to do it, but unfortunately they asked me if I wouldn't participate by phone. And so my hearing's going, the phone reception wasn't great, I spilled my sandwich on my lap, and I was just unhappy as I walked in here tonight. And I have felt my spirits soar as I join this panel. I'm really honored to sit here with Chris Killian and Julie Moore, who are two people more than anybody else in the state of Vermont who have committed their lives, professional lives, to addressing clean water issues in the state of Vermont. I'm a latecomer to this work, and I'm deeply grateful to the foundation of work that they and others that have been working with them have laid. So the main thing that I want to convey in the short time I have, and I know we'll dive deeper into this, is a really simple proposition that right now, we in the state of Vermont need to pony up and invest in clean water. We need a dedicated, long-term, stable source of state funding. Period. That's what we need to do. Now, just saying that is, I don't want to ignore all the complexities behind that. When I think of good clean water policy, I think of a three-legged stool. Funding is a piece of it. Accountability is another major part of it. And good education and information is the third leg of that stool. When we talk about the first leg and funding, the part we want to talk about tonight, I'm not suggesting that the source of state funding that we'll be discussing, hopefully, and talking through would be the only source of funding. We're operating in a highly complex environment already in terms of funding. We have substantial federal dollars, thanks to the support of our delegation led by Senator Leahy. We have funding that comes through EPA, through transportation, through Department of Agriculture, through the Lake Champlain Basin Program. Substantial federal dollars flow to clean water projects in this state. We also already have a set of state funding that goes. We have state transportation dollars, state agriculture dollars. We have state dollars that support the Agency of Natural Resources. We have a variety of programs at the state level that are dedicated to and invested in clean water. We have state capital dollars that our legislature appropriate each year. We also have municipal dollars, substantial municipal dollars that come through the bonding and the rates and the some communities that have utilities. And finally, we have a lot of private funding that's going to clean water already. We have the work that developers are doing, that farmers are investing, that loggers and forest sector are investing. It's not like we're writing on a blank slate. But we know that that's not enough. We know that the current system that we have in place is not getting the job done. All the trends are going the wrong direction. If we're going to turn the curve, we need to have additional funding, and we need funding that's freed from some of the constraints that come with the federal dollars or existing constraints on the state capital funds, and we can't rely on municipalities and private industry to do it all on their own. We need state dollars that have flexible, strategic opportunities to use in ways that we'll talk further about tonight. That's my main message. But I also don't want the conversation about funding to ignore the fact that we need to operate in a system in which we also have accountability and we have strong and effective investment in information and education and technical assistance and all of that category of work. On the accountability side, I don't mean just accountability for the regulated community, although that's critical. We need to have a set of regulations, clear expectations that farmers, that developers, that businesses need to comply with, and we need agencies that have the capacity to enforce those requirements. We also need accountability from municipalities to fulfill their obligations. And we also need the state agencies to be accountable for the deliverables on the programs that they need to deliver, held accountable ultimately by the legislature. We need accountability. Ultimately, we have to be accountable to the federal government to comply with the Clean Water Act. And the third leg is also critical. We need to collect information. We have to use science and evaluate, are we making progress? Are the solutions that we're implementing being successful? And where they're not, we need to tie that back in and adjust the actions that we're taking. And we need to share that information effectively with the public, with the regulated community, with farmers and developers. And as Secretary Moore can explain better than I, we're not talking rocket science. At the end of the day, the solutions to the issues that we're facing largely are oriented around nutrient pollution, sediment runoff, and erosion. Those are issues that we can deal with. It's not cheap and it's not easy, but they aren't complicated. We don't need some new black box technology. We don't have to wait for someone with 6 PhDs to come up with a solution. We have all of the solutions and the ideas necessary to get this done. What we need is, I think ultimately the missing piece right now of the puzzle is a dedicated source of state funding to help drive and coordinate that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julie?
Sure. So I think picking up on a couple of the themes David mentioned, complexity is certainly one of them. There are an awful lot of moving pieces, and I will hopefully speak to a few of them in my remarks. And I have a theme and variation in many ways on the three-legged stool that David described. I think of the three legs of the stool as the technical know-how, and I would agree that that's a place where we have a considerable depth of knowledge here in Vermont, the financial capability, and that's one where we're building, and also political will as being the third leg of that stool. That we need a commitment, and it's a long-term commitment. We're lucky here in Vermont. Water is really abundant and generally of very high quality. But the reason we're all here tonight is because it's also at risk. And we have some crystal clear examples of how that risk can manifest itself in our waters. Lake Carmi this summer and fall, it was probably the most glaring example, but similar conditions have been experienced in other bodies throughout Vermont. St. Albans Bay and Missisquoi Bay receive a lot of attention, but we know there have also been blooms recently in Lake Moray, Tickle Naked Pond, and Shelburne Pond, to name a few. And the risks extend beyond nutrient pollution and sometimes reflect bad past practice, such as the contamination of the drinking water wells for hundreds of homes in Bennington County, a situation we're continuing to recover from. My agency is deeply engaged in the science and engineering of water quality and water quality solutions, and we know that the only way to figure out what's happening on our planet, in our state, in our communities, right down to our streams, rivers, lakes, and ponds, is to measure it, and to measure it systematically and as quantitatively as possible. And we need to track change year over year. Much of Vermont's water pollution, as you'll hear tonight, and as David alluded to, is attributable to wet weather events. It's stormwater runoff, snow melt, and flood-related erosion. And we also know that weather is variable from year to year. So sometimes the trends we're looking for can be really hard to discern in the noise of the variability in weather. Further, many of the best strategies for addressing these wet weather pollution sources rely on natural solutions, allowing woody vegetation to reestablish along our stream banks and rivers, installing rain gardens and what we often refer to as green infrastructure practices to intercept and store stormwater, and plugging ditches on marginal farmland to allow the wetlands that were once there to reform and revegetate. And we have examples of all those projects and more on our landscape. Funding is essential to the work that lies ahead, and the work is not cheap. We've estimated that there's an annual investment of $100 million required each year to protect, restore, and sustain water quality statewide. And so there is a real question about where this money will come from. As David noted, there are 4 primary funding sources, but it really ultimately all comes down to us. 2/3 of the funding is relatively evenly split between the state and municipalities right now. Federal funding accounts for about 1/4 of what we currently invest annually in clean water, and the balance coming from private property owners. As many of you have read, I'm sure, I chaired a working group this summer and fall that was asked by the legislature to identify long-term funding for water quality. And I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you, as it did to me, that there aren't any easy answers. Each funding source has its limitations, and there are really very real and significant competing demands. The funding conversation has to support prioritized, cost-effective solutions rather than funding being the solution. The working group did take a deep dive into 2 of the funding strategies that are most often talked about. These are a per parcel fee and an impervious surface fee, which we may discuss in more detail later. And we found that the administrative costs of both of those are disproportionate to the amount of revenue that needed to be raised. The report, however, did identify a series of next steps that we believe are essential to moving this long-term water quality funding conversation forward. First is to review the amount of cost share the state provides for different types of projects so that we have an accurate assessment of the state's overall financial commitment. We also need to evaluate different ways to collect that revenue, knowing that the 2 we tested weren't cost effective, but knowing that there must be one out there that is. And then finally, we need to look at service delivery, how we are actually going to get these investments on the ground, and look forward to these meaty conversations in the legislature this year, and in fact started them earlier this week with the House Institutions Committee, who took up our report in advance of the session. To my mind, another critical question is how will we convince Vermonters to continue to make investments in water quality, knowing that our progress won't be seen as a steady incremental reduction in phosphorus pollution on a year-to-year basis or in direct response to a funding allocation. The work that lies ahead is literally tens of thousands of projects. Most of them are modest in scale. Things like installing large angular stone in roadside ditches to prevent erosion, working with farmers to expand the adoption of cover crops that will hold and protect soils from the late fall through the early spring, and working with landowners, large and small, to install practices that seek to hold rainfall as close as possible to where it lands and give it time to soak away. Inasmuch as it requires all these types of things, it also requires patience that we stay this course. We know that in complex systems, we need to act in order to learn, but we also need to innovate, and keeping our eyes and minds open to what may come next and how we might achieve our goals more efficiently and effectively is incredibly important. To me, on the immediate horizon, this looks like several things. Smart stormwater systems that can incorporate weather forecasts and real-time data on flow, which allow for the maximum amount of pollutants to be captured not only in new stormwater facilities, but to get better performance out of some of the existing stormwater ponds that dot our developed landscape.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Julie.
Wrap up?
Yeah.
All right. Let me just give my other two ideas and I'll stop. Because
Okay.
I would like them to be part of the conversation.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay.
I think we also need to look at the phosphorus that's in dairy manure and sewage sludge truly as a resource and seek cost-effective ways to extract and recycle it. Ultimately, we need our watershed to be in balance. We need the phosphorus that's used on our land to be recycled back and forth and stop the importation of phosphorus into Vermont. It's a huge book of work. We have lots of work to do, and I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Thank you. Chris?
I want to start by, I guess on the way up here, I was running through how many agency secretaries I've had this conversation with. And I came up with 11, which is on average one every 2 years, roughly, since I started working in the state. And countless Department of Environmental Conservation commissioners, multiple governors, multiple federal administrations. And the one thing I would ask of my colleagues here at the table is to jettison the message that we have to be patient. To stop telling people that we need to wait 30 years or 50 years. It took a long time for it to get this polluted, and it's going to take a long time. So the green water that's coming out of your tap on Lake Carmi, you're just going to need to live with that because it's really hard and it takes a long time. That is the wrong message. It's the message that we've been sending to people as all of these waters have become more and more and more foul. And we've studied and restudied and studied again and adopted flawed studies that everyone knew was flawed and had to be overturned by federal judges after millions of dollars of litigation. It's got to stop. The message is urgency. The message is this is solvable, and we as a government are here to solve it on the public's behalf because we are the trustees of the waters of the United States, the waters of this state. It is not acceptable to go into St. Albans or go to the Tyler Place on Missisquoi Bay or go to Lake Carmi and tell people they need to be patient. The time for patience is over. And I guess I'm also coming to terms with the fact that maybe I'm the living proof of the definition of insanity. Because I've gone to the meetings and I've raised the issues. I've filed personally and on behalf of 2 different NGOs in this state close to 30 lawsuits and lost one of them. And I'm proud of that. But Lake Carmi is beyond a living example. It's a horror show. It's completely unacceptable. The Cuyahoga River was on fire Lake Carmi might as well be on fire. It's that bad. It's terrible. Dead fish, dead waterfowl, people at risk of horrible diseases and illnesses. And that is the portent of things to come more broadly in Lake Champlain unless we change our behavior. Now, I have faith in government, and I was introduced recently at a conference as a revolutionary. And I am maybe the quintessential example of an idealistically faithful believer in our democracy and in our government institutions. I'm the farthest thing from a revolutionary because I go to court and I go into the legislature and I appeal to my leaders, my elected leaders and appointed leaders within the democracy to take care of these problems. And that is their job. And it's time to embrace the notion that these problems are solvable, and they're solvable in the near term. If we had taken that viewpoint 30 years ago when I started working in this state, where would we be now? Why don't we have a 10-year capital budget to upgrade all of our wastewater treatment plants to limit of technology? I work in states where every municipality is operating their wastewater treatment plant at levels that not a single facility in the state of Vermont is achieving. We're so far behind the times on that one simple example that we cannot in any way claim that we are a forward-looking green state. It's unconscionable. We know what the solutions are on pavement. And guess what? The public doesn't have to pay for Walmart to not pollute the water. Why are we not exercising? I would testify in the Vermont legislature in 1991 on this issue, and then Secretary of A&R Jan Eastman, recently appointed by recently deceased, rest in peace, Governor Snelling, but kept on by Governor Dean, said, we don't need any additional authority. We have all the authority we need in Vermont law to solve this problem. And we're confident that we're going to comply with the deadline and the water quality standards of 1996. And the Lake Champlain's going to be cleaned up. So don't follow Mr. Killian's recommendations. Don't listen to VNRC or the Lake Champlain Committee or Conservation Law Foundation because they've got it all wrong. We don't need any additional authority. What happened to that? Why are we not enforcing our laws and embracing the polluter pays principle and requiring for-profit enterprises like the commercial real estate industry, large institutions like UVM and Middlebury, and for-profit farms that operate in a competitive environment just like every other business to pay their own way and not pollute our waters? So my message is urgency, and that the public writ large should not embrace the notion that they have to pay a fee in order to bail out industries that are polluting our water. Thank you.
Thank you. This is going to be a great panel.
I had to say that. I'm sorry.
No, that was a great speech. So how do we act? What steps do we take? If we're going to take steps right now, what are they? And is it just money? Is it also maybe taking some steps to actually change the way we do things without spending money? Chris, do you want to start, or do you want to have Julie start? Are you ready to go?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, what steps should we take? And we'll go back in reverse order, and then next time, Julie, you'll start, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that my first message, again, is a change in leadership posture, that the message needs to change from one of patience and you have to wait and someday clean water will come, to urgency and problem solving now. And we need to see that from the governor on down in the executive branch and certainly in the legislature as well. But that leads to the fact that we made modest gains and improvements a couple of years ago when Act 64 was signed into law, what is referred to as the Vermont Clean Water Act. And I say modest because there's broad acknowledgement that the requirements of that law will not clean up Lake Champlain. But right now, we're awaiting the agency's issuance of a permit that would require retrofits of the largest of the large paved surfaces in the state, 3 acres or greater of pavement. And I personally see no way that deadline is being met, but maybe the secretary can disabuse that. I'm also terribly concerned that another modest step dealing with installation of tile drainage on farm fields that requires a rule to be completed by statute by mid-January cannot be met at this point. And I'm very concerned that one of the key accountability metrics that was put in Act 64 and in the state's commitments to EPA to clean up the lake was establishment of a long-term funding source. And we're now hearing that that could be years out in the future. I have faith in the governor. I've worked with the governor for years, and I'm hopeful. I haven't seen actions yet, and I'm not among those that have criticized as yet the administration's actions or inactions, but I'm very worried that these near-term accountability metrics will not be met. And I think they're a litmus test for our seriousness moving forward in meeting the requirements of that law and taking these modest steps. I would also mention that I think we need to just acknowledge that it may be impossible to have a clean lake if we continue to promote conventional agriculture in the current model, that we need to think about a different model that's in fact sustainable and that could reduce the amount of phosphorus that we're bringing in feed and fertilizer.
Thank you. Julie?
Sure. I would respond that we are taking steps. Action is actively underway and has been for a number of years, with new actions, many of which Chris alluded to, codified under Act 64, including the systematic inspection of all Vermont dairy farms at this point, with implementation of projects ongoing to address needs that were identified, stormwater retrofits, voluntary ones that are being promoted by watershed groups and conservation districts and implemented on properties with willing landowner partners, and a whole suite of road improvement projects. We have issued a draft municipal roads general permit, which will require improved management of runoff from roads throughout the state of Vermont. And ran what we called a grant and aid program this summer to sort of spark interest, knowing that permit will take effect soon. And fully 75% of municipalities in Vermont signed up for this grant and aid program and implemented water quality best management practices during the past construction season. I think the challenge is one of the fact that there are literally, as I said, tens of thousands of projects that are needed, and most of them are modest, but there are innumerable ones already underway. We've put $13 million into action since July 1st alone and are on track to put more than $20 million into action during the current state fiscal year, with an equal commitment in the following year. The questions that we are asking, or that I'm asking as part of this water quality funding working group, are essential and they're foundational, and I don't think they can be shortchanged. Without a clear plan, not only for raising revenue, but how we're going to put it back on the ground, we will quickly find, as the Water Quality Working Group heard, that there is a complete lack of consensus with folks about the best investments to make and how to make them and when. And we need to get into the details of that conversation, not as an attempt to delay what needs to be done, but as a reflection of the reality of what needs to be done.
Thank you, David.
There's a joke my grandfather used to tell me about, so there's this rabbi and a couple of folks come up to him and say, have an argument, and they ask him to resolve it, and he listens to the first person, he says, you know, you're right. And then the second person argues with him, or Ben, he says, you know, you're right too. And then someone who's walking by says, Rabbi, they can't both be right. And he says, you know, you're right. I kind of feel like that, like they're both Julie and Chris are right. Except I think there's more to it, in the sense of, you know, Julie's identified, I think, some of the key areas. And in fact, we do know, you know, as we put together the plan when I was with the state, we went through and looked at the research and the data, where the pollution was coming from, thanks to some data, in fact, that Julie and her, Secretary Moore and her team, when she was at Stone, collected. There's a lot of good information about the sources of pollution, the quantities of pollution, and we compared the costs of what were the biggest sources and what was most cost effective. The things that rose to the top, that won't surprise you, were farms, farm runoff. And not just what's going on in the barnyard or the, where the confined feeding operation is, but out in the fields. We realized we had for too long ignored all the manure that was being applied in the fields and the field practices. Roads was another one. Municipal roads, back roads in the state, and ditching along paved roads is a major source of pollution. Developed land runoff. All the parking lots that are not fitted out with proper stormwater systems. And it's the biggest ones are the easiest and the most cost-effective to get after. So we are, I think Secretary Moore is right, we're working on the right topics. Act 64 lays out a set of expectations of the state to work on all of those things, and they are working on all of them. But I agree with Chris, not fast enough, and I don't think we have the right mix right now of the combination of funding, education, information, and monitoring, and accountability. We need more accountability. We need those rules, and not unexpectedly, and we knew this would happen, that it's relatively easy for the legislature to say, go out there, state, and regulate developers, go out and regulate farmers. But when you get actually to it, that begins to build the political backlash. And so already there's building at the State House and in front of these agencies pressure to not move as quickly and to make it more complicated and confusing. I don't think it is. I think we need to move forward aggressively on these issues. At the same time, I also think that the key element that's missing and part of the theme of this discussion tonight is a source of state funding to catalyze through incentives, through low-interest loans, through a variety, through getting matching dollars from the philanthropic community and to catalyze more federal dollars. There's a lot of ways in which flexible state dollars can be brought to bear to incentivize and drive new approaches. And the last thing I'll say is I ultimately think that agriculture is such a major piece of this puzzle that we have to tackle and we have to confront the fact that we have really a marginal economic system in terms of our farmers. And that's not the farmer's fault. That has to do with national economics. That has to do with national farm and federal farm policy and milk pricing. They're working hard to barely make a living, to lose money. We have to find a way as a state to step in. If we want to save our agricultural economy and the iconic landscape that goes with that, we have to work with the farm community to help them be successful economically. I don't have all the answers to that, but I know that it involves more than just wringing our hands together. I think bringing some state dollars to bear and helping to facilitate and promote different models of farming, other than having so much land that's bare dirt in the spring and the fall and applying large amounts of liquid manure in the spring. All the cover cropping in the world is not going to deal with all the phosphorus that's being put on the landscape and running off into our streams. We have to do some fundamental thinking about how agriculture operates in the state. And that's not me pointing fingers at farmers, because I think well-managed agricultural lands, good, healthy soils, are in fact a big part of the solution, and we need to help our farmers figure out a way to get there.
Thank you. So on that, are there some practical solutions that might be a little bit out of the box, that might have been experimented with in other states, that Vermont could use to basically help farmers, help us clean up the lake? Are there some practical steps, such as something radical like, I don't know, banning commercial fertilizer, closing dairy farms around Lake Carmi, using some kind of injection device like they do in the Midwest for manure? Are there some things that could be done? Because I heard the other day, Bobby Starr said, we're going to be spending $1 million on every manure pit in the state. Do we have enough money to spend $1 million on 1,100 dairy farms for manure pits?
So I'd start by saying I think that number is high, but point well taken, that some of the investments that need to be made on farms are significant, and frankly are really significant when you compare them to sort of the net worth of the farm. And that's where the Farm Viability Project, which is a program run by the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, comes in. It works with farmers to look at the economics of their situation, to look at the investments that they need to make, and determine what the best path forward is for them, whether it's to continue with the same agricultural and economic model that they currently operate under, or whether there's one that could help them be more successful, diversifying operations, looking at different livestock or crops that they might produce on their land, and to David's point, recognizing the inherent value that good, well-managed agricultural lands have for water quality. So I think that that's a really important piece, and frankly, something that's fairly innovative here in the state of Vermont. The idea I alluded to in my opening remarks about looking at phosphorus as a commodity and the opportunity to see an economic return on phosphorus as a commodity is another piece. I've been reading a lot recently about work that's done in Europe where they've created a renewable phosphorus standard that promotes the recycling of phosphorus within a particular country. They have some pretty clear political drivers for doing that work, and that much of Europe depends on phosphorus mined in Morocco for their agricultural operations. But I think there's some really key pieces in what they're doing there. We have a significant phosphorus imbalance in our watershed. We import more phosphorus in fertilizer and feed than we export as milk and meat. And until we get back in balance, it's going to be hard to achieve our water quality goals. So something like a renewable phosphorus standard could play an important piece of that puzzle as well.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to go?
Well, on the farm topic in particular, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, I think we just need to look at a new and different model as the primary model that is promoted and supported by the state of Vermont. A model that's focused on grass-based feed and organic milk production as that's conceived of at this time, and that should be the primary promotional posture and investment posture that we're focused on as a state. Because as Julie indicated, if we continue to pull this much phosphorus in particular, but nitrogen and other constituents as well into our watersheds and continue to manage our lands in the same way that we are now, and try to consider it to be a technology or technical management problem, we'll never see Missisquoi Bay turn around. We'll never see Lake Carmi turn around. We'll never see St. Albans Bay turn around. We're seeing these things, these issues spread and crop up in new places in Lake Champlain. For the first time in memory, people saw signs warning them to stay away from the lake in Button Bay State Park and the Panton Shore this year. And it was shocking to people there and has motivated a very large group of people to come out and start getting much more active. But we can't expect things to change without fundamentally changing the model. And toward that end, I think first and foremost, we just need a realistic assessment of what the actual externalized cost is now. What would it take by way of investment, price tag, technical change to actually come anywhere near managing the phosphorus associated with the conventional model? Because I think we'll find that it's absolutely astronomical, and we should put that on the back of that industry. And that should be the motivator for change. Thank you, David.
Well, I would just start by saying I think we all need to beware the snake oil salesman. You know, Secretary Moore probably has experienced the same thing I did when I was in state government, which is a number of people that come and they have a magic idea, the magic solution, the one magic wand thing they're going to do, and it will solve all the problems. I don't think there's any one magic solution. I don't think there's a technology just waiting out there to be discovered that's going to fix this. You know, I've had people say, why can't we let's harvest all the cyanobacteria out of Missisquoi Bay and we'll turn it into energy, and wouldn't that be great? There are not those kinds of solutions. I would just disabuse people of waiting for or wanting to do more study and waiting for the next thing. As Chris has indicated, we know enough to act now. So with that doesn't mean, though, we can just pick one thing to act on. We have a lot of ideas out there. I think the idea of looking at how to recover phosphorus from manure and sewage and making a market for that is a great idea. Looking at anaerobic digestion and recovering energy from manure is a great idea. Low impact development, as Secretary Moore indicated, and green stormwater infrastructure. I lived for a period of time in the Pacific Northwest, which is way ahead of us on this. You have communities in Olympia and Seattle who are competing to have their communities invest in green stormwater infrastructure because it makes their neighborhoods look beautiful, and it increases property values, and it reduces stormwater pollution. There are a whole bunch of things that we can do in the area of stormwater that are right at our fingertips that have multiple payoffs. Restoration of wetlands and floodplains. That is a magic solution. There are many communities and watersheds across the state where we have seen immediate and direct benefits of restoring wetlands and floodplains. It's not easy. It's not an easy conversation because it starts talking about land use decisions and local government prerogatives versus the state and who's in charge of me kinds of questions. But those are questions where, at least from the scientific standpoint, the solutions kind of leap off the page at you in terms of where we should make investment. And again, I come back to thinking while there's not one technology and one particular policy solution, there also isn't one regulation that's going to get it done either. It's the mix of, you need accountability, you need a regulatory backstop, you need the courts, and you need litigation enforcement to be there to make sure everyone is on an even playing field. But at the same time, you need support. You need education and assistance and funding and incentives and loan programs that help people adopt the new practices. If we're going to really transform the way we live on this landscape, the way that we need to, it's going to take more than just regulations. We can't regulate our way out of this.
Okay, we're ready for your questions now. That went very fast.
Long-winded.
Oh, you all did great. Please take the mic.
So here we are in Burlington, and I know you've sort of landed on farms in the agricultural landscape, but I'm very curious what the role of Burlington has in all of this, especially it's the largest city within the state and its influence on the lake. And I'm not aware of any leadership by the city. And so I would like to know what the city should be doing.
Great. Julie, you want to start?
Sure. The city of Burlington is, to my mind, doing a lot when it comes to water quality. And in one of the other areas of innovation that I didn't speak about is this idea of integrated permitting and planning, which the city of Burlington is out in front nationally on, looking at ways to prioritize across the need to address combined sewer overflows. So the combined sewer system here in the city carries stormwater and wastewater in a single pipe and can overflow dilute but untreated sewage during significant rainfall events. Addressing stormwater pollution, addressing needed improvements at their wastewater treatment facility. And all of these aggregate in the small streams throughout the city that run directly into the lake. So the city's looking at ways to restore the flow regime in those streams, to reduce combined sewer overflows, and as I indicated, to sort of change the fundamental paradigm that we as a society have had for hundreds of years, which is we need to get our stormwater away from us as quickly as possible. There's work that's been done over on Cherry and College Streets as demonstration projects with stormwater bump outs and changes in the green space. Use of permeable pavement has been piloted in a number of different spots here in the city. There is a lot of work underway. I think a lot of it is invisible or low visibility, but it's important. And I would say the city of Burlington, frankly, is in some ways out in front and thinking about how to do this work comprehensively on a citywide scale.
Thank you. Do either of you want to take that, David? You want to?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Wayne. Do you want to go, Chris?
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead.
Go for it. Go, Chris.
City of Burlington is way behind, not a leader. City of Burlington benefits from two very damaging, politically driven outcomes. One was a decision. Well, the Burlington, Maine wastewater treatment plant is operating under a permit that expired in 1999. That permit and related regulatory authorizations allow the city to not separate combined sewers, and that has been the case for decades. It has severely delayed the city's investment in separation of combined sewers. And the Band-Aid is a vortex shock chlorination facility that results in contact time at peak flows of about 30 seconds before that highly chlorinated water is discharged just beyond the breakwater into Burlington Bay. And there's a giant mixing zone out there that no one should be swimming in. And unfortunately, there's really no distinction between Burlington Bay and the main lake. And I say unfortunately just because of where that gunk flows and where the stormwater goes. But that's the other deal that was made. We drew a line between Red Rocks and Rock Point on the map just beyond North Beach, and we said, this is a bay. And we set the highest phosphorus standard for any segment of the lake in that, well, any segment attached to the main lake in that water body. And Burlington probably could never violate that standard in lake. And so we celebrate the fact that we never violate the phosphorus standard in Burlington Bay, but that's just because we cut a huge regulatory loophole in our protections of the lake. Burlington, Burlington hasn't been sued over any of this. That's probably just by virtue of the fact that it's not a very big city and doesn't scale up. I've sued most of the big cities in southern New England over these issues, and they all are way ahead of where Burlington is. And I think that the staff within DPW really work hard to do what they can with what they get. But we need dramatic overhauls in phosphorus control, recommitment to elimination of CSO, combined sewer overflows, which is basically raw sewage, diluted, but raw sewage when it happens. And the incredibly slow pace of dealing with stormwater runoff in this. And Secretary Moore is right. We have demonstration projects and we have pilots, but we need systematic effort to address the paved runoff from UVM and Burlington writ large right into the lake. Not dribs and drabs and pieces parts, but like, let's do it. Let's do what Portland, Oregon did. Of course, they had a federal court order that told them they had to do it, and they quickly figured out that green infrastructure was better than big pipes and storage tanks, and that's what they're doing, and it's beautiful. The last thing I would say is that pilot projects and demonstration projects in the stormwater realm have generally turned out to be failures, because unless somebody owns the liability, nobody wants to take care of it over time. So we've gone to a lot of private developers, not a lot, but a few in the state, and done really interesting private development retrofits, and nobody wants to touch it after it's in place, and they almost all fail or have huge issues going forward because there's no one to hold accountable. And that's why we need to switch from pilot projects and government-funded grant programs at Shearer Chevrolet, and instead say, hey, guess what? Private business, you have a big parking lot. You're dumping a lot of crap in the water. You're responsible. You clean it up. And we're going to hold you accountable, because unless you have somebody own that liability over time, and that's true with municipalities too, these projects are orphaned and abandoned and they fail.
Thank you, David.
The part I want to focus on is a place where I think Burlington really is making a difference and making some progress. And I'm not suggesting that they've gotten to where the city needs to be, but the work that under the mayor's leadership and the work of his team on stormwater management, they've made some important progress in laying the groundwork, the infrastructure, the human capacity, and the systems to address those issues. And we're in a place now where I'd encourage those of you who are residents of Burlington to advocate for more and faster. But I don't think we're at a place where you can say that Burlington has utterly failed. I think there's some really important steps that have been taken. I think one fundamental issue has been the city's decision over the past decades to turn its face to the lake. for so many decades, the city had its back turned towards the lake. It was treated as a dump, as the backyard of the industrial facilities on the lakefront. It's now become the centerpiece and a feature of the city. And the businesses in this community are benefiting from that, and they recognize it. The Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce in Chittenden County has really acknowledged the importance of stepping forward for the economic future of this region to deal with clean water. We're at a moment where we can ask what Chris is asking of the regulated community in collaboration with municipalities like South Burlington and Colchester, to step up and to form stormwater utilities in partnership with the state and driven by the state. I think the state also has accountability, and I'll hold my hand up as part of responsibility for that we need to do more to drive our communities to take the tough steps to drive to higher utility rates and to systems that make the investments we need to make as communities and as private businesses. And I'll just conclude with one thought. I agree. I've committed my career to the concept that the policy of polluter pays is good fundamental policy. It's a policy we adopted starting in the late 60s and have adhered to greater or lesser degrees since. But dilute stormwater runoff is a harder one to puzzle over when you talk about who is the polluter. True, the large box stores and the gas stations and the farms are all polluters. But all of us have responsibility, all of us that drive on the roads, that use these facilities. There's that have put fertilizer on our yards, that have homes and driveways. So we need to, as we think about funding sources, which we haven't actually talked enough about today, we need to talk about sources of funding that do go to the places of impact, which are not just a set of big box stores. It also includes all of us that have driveways, roofs, and the like, and that drive on our roads.
Thank you.
I'm James Maroney. I'm thrilled to hear Chris Killian talk about it being time to stop being patient. Indeed, Vermont has spent 50 years and about $2 billion on this program, and it keeps getting worse. So from the point of the sort of average Vermonter, you kind of wonder, well, why are they coming up with yet another plan to fix the lake with such a bad history? I'm also thrilled to hear Professor Mears talk, unless I misunderstood you, to say that conventional agriculture needs to come under scrutiny, and we need a new model. I would disagree with you, however, in that when you say there is no sort of one fix, I mean, there is. If the state of Vermont converted its agriculture to Patrick Leahy's National Organic Program and stopped trying to design a agricultural practices model that avoids the very thing that is polluting the lake. Everyone in this room knows that agriculture is responsible for 50% of it, but Act 64 makes no material constraints against conventional dairy. So what we're faced with is funding a law which is going to cost $1.5 billion or $2.5 billion if the federal government falls away from us, and we leave in place the state's largest polluter. If we converted the entire agricultural industry in Vermont to organic, the problem would start going backward within a few years, 2 or 3, maybe 5. And I didn't even mention cost. The plan, Act 64, offers the state's farmers to increase their costs at a time when they're already sucking wind. It offers them no incentive to change. The state should pay them to convert. And I don't mean some of them. I mean all of them.
May I? When I was 5 years old, my dad bought a chicken farm, 100-acre chicken farm, and it was the same year, it turns out, that Frank Perdue turned his family chicken farm into a factory. Nobody came and offered us money to stay in farming. If you had a Teflon plant that was polluting the lake, you wouldn't accept it. You would shut them down if they were still operating. Sure, if it became a Superfund site, you'd go back in and you'd pour money, and the taxpayers would have to pay for it. I'm new to the state, and I cannot understand why I, as a taxpayer, am being asked to subsidize known sources that are the major source of pollution. And I guess I would poise it into a question. In fact, I asked Ms. Moore about this once at a meeting of the Winooski, Friends of Winooski meeting. And the answer kind of was, and I went away mad, kind of was, well, we've got this tradition. So are we trying to save the red barns and silos in the open land spaces? Are we trying to save a culture, and why should we subsidize that? Is that really what we're trying to do? Is that where the political resistance comes from, because we don't want to be mean to the farmers because they are, they're part of our culture and our landscape? Thank you.
Thank you. Julie, you want to try again to answer that question?
Sure. I would offer that farmers are active partners in a lot of the work that needs to be done on the landscape. I think it's important to consider what happens if the farms go off the landscape, and that there are other land uses that are challenging from a water quality perspective in their own right. I would say farms have really stepped up over the past 5 to 10 years and are doing far more and far more quickly than they have in the past. They are also subject to far more regulation than they have been in the past. And as David alluded to, there is some pushback in the agricultural community, frankly, over the amount of regulation that they've seen, but we continue to plod forward. The agriculture is a part of Vermont's history. It's also an incredibly important part of Vermont's economy, and we need to find a way to make all of these pieces work together. I believe the approach we have laid out and are in the course of implementing will achieve those goals, and it may be that we have to agree to disagree a bit.
Thank you.
If I
David?
could weigh in, we talk about farmers, but farmers aren't like a monolithic entity. We got small farmers, mid-sized farmers, large farmers. We've had a huge impetus, economic impetus across the country, including Vermont, towards larger and larger and larger farms. That's not part of our culture and history. We don't need to continue to acquiesce in that. We can resist. I don't see us moving in the place that Mr. Maroney suggested, where we somehow mandate at a state level of what the economic model is for our farms. I don't want to live in a country in which government can tell farmers what kind of farming they can do. But the results, the point that you're making, I think, is that the outcomes, the pollution, the ancillary impacts on the rest of the community need to be accounted for. I agree with that. I think that's partly dealt with through regulation. But having met with hundreds of farmers across the state, they're hungry to be part of the solution. And if we can help find economic models that work for them so they can buy a car, have nice homes, put their kids through college, all the things that the rest of us want, if we can find ways for them to do that, they're on board. What I fear is that if we rely just on regulations, and it's not that I'm saying we shouldn't have regulations, and I think we should enforce the ones we've got. But if we try to keep ratcheting it up too fast, the farms that we lose are the small and mid-sized farms. That's part of the iconic Vermont landscape. That's part of the rich, diverse heritage of our communities. That's what we need to invest in, is helping those farmers be successful. And Secretary Moore mentioned it. It's something that we worked on under the Shumlin administration. I think we need to continue to invest in, is how do we create models, economically successful models of farming in this state that will help our farmers and help clean water. And those exist. I've seen them.
Oh, I would just like to disagree with David to some extent. We are telling farmers how they need to farm. And we're doing it through a Byzantine, socialized industry pricing system and conventional dairy model that basically buys people into this hugely capital intensive, terribly polluting and land damaging, water damaging model. And we've had historically in the dairy sector, we've had whole herd buyouts. We've had periods where there's great milk surplus as recently as occurred, and we're dumping milk on the ground. And with that in mind, there are lots of reasonable steps that can be made, including concepts like paying people to change their model. That shouldn't be that foreign in this environment, given the policies that we set and the ways that we're implementing them. I think Act 64 gravitated in the direction it did as an intermediate step in the dialogue and was accompanied by a groundbreaking agreement brokered in the context of the environmental court to implement significantly enhanced management practices in the Missisquoi River watershed. Now, it's an open question, and we signed that agreement, as did the Attorney General's office, and it was brokered in the governor's office. There was high-level commitment to it at that time from the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources and others, and leadership from the governor. But it needs to be implemented. We're actually meeting with the Secretary of Ag tomorrow about that. And if it's not being implemented, then it's going to be back to the policy fights. The reason that we've focused on regulation in the near term is because we think cost is a major factor in determining how people behave. And if we just continue to say, well, you know, we're going to give you huge property tax breaks because you manage big tracts of currently undeveloped land, but we're not going to have any kind of planning obligation or environmental protection obligation associated with that under current use, we're going to get the same thing. It's time to start making realistic policy decisions that change the model, and the kinds of things that James Moroney was just mentioning should be clearly part of the dialogue. And it's not true that the farmers with new models that are getting forced out or with enhanced regulation are getting forced out are all the small ones. We have seen success in the organic industry, and a lot of the organic herds and grass-based herds are smaller, and they're about soil health, and they're doing better from an environmental perspective. So let's go there and let's make that the future of Vermont.
So you mentioned the whole herd buyouts. Would it work to have a whole farm buyout program? In the long run, would that be more effective and cheaper?
Well, I think a big near-term challenge to get to new models in the dairy industry is transition. Getting from where we are now, where people in the conventional model are operating at very high economies of scale with huge debt and massive investment in equipment and inputs and feed, and getting them to a different model where their margins are better and they're making more money potentially, although we've had recent not so great history there too. And I think the whole farm buyout piece is a little bit more concerning to me, just because we're never going to have enough money to buy all the land. And do we really just want that land in some form of public or publicly protected ownership?
No, the dairy farmers would own it.
Well, if the dairy farmers can own it, they still need to figure out how to pay the property taxes and keep it in some sort of viable operation.
Value for the land.
It's true. And maybe that would be enough for people to sit back, but we want people to be operating and productively part of our society, and I think there are ways to transition our agriculture to do that. That's my view.
Okay, we're going to take another question. This gentleman right here in the striped shirt is next.
So we've heard we need to consider lots of different actions we need to be taking, and we should consider lots of different potential funding sources. And David suggested that we be wary of snake oil salesmen with one simple solution, be it organic farming or anything else. But let me just tell you, the Gund Institute at the university has a Gund Slam, and the last couple of them have been down at Echo. And at the Gund Slam, faculty and graduate students and postdocs give short presentations. And one that I heard 2 years ago offered a solution, maybe a silver bullet type of solution. I think. Let me try. So it's basically 100-foot mandatory 100-foot riparian forest, around any river or stream or lake in the state. And not expecting the farmers to just willingly give up that 100 feet, that because you see, just driving from Burlington to Montpelier, you just see along the Winooski River where cows are walking right to the edge and sloughing off and pooping in the river and so forth. If instead of that you had 100 feet of riparian forest and barbed wire fence to keep the cows from getting to the water, to the river, according to this gun presentation, it sounded like that would go a long way to solving the agricultural part. And again, the agricultural part is only like 50% of the phosphorus pollution of Lake Champlain. But is that too simplified? Is that a snake oil solution that we should be very wary of? And again, we're not talking about how we're going to pay for that. But I've just followed up. I know a farmer in the Lewis Creek watershed and in the Winooski watershed and the Missisquoi watershed, and ask all of them. And again, as David said, a lot of the farmers want to be part of the solution. All of those farmers say, we'd love to do that. We'd love to do that, but we need somebody else to help pay for it. We're not willing to knock that land out of active production without some kind of compensation or something, financial incentive.
I don't think it's a silver bullet, but it is a great idea, and we've taken some steps. When we passed the shoreline protection law a couple of years ago around that deals with lakes and ponds, was basically recognizing that having vegetated buffers between developed land or farms and the receiving waters is a critical piece of the puzzle. One of the challenges on riverine systems, on rivers and streams, however, there are a couple of problems. One with farms. If you go up Franklin County or Addison County, you'll see a lot of those farms are bisected by ditches. So unless you are having vegetation 100-foot buffers along all the ditches and the streams that flow through those farms, then essentially those are shortcuts. You could have all the buffer you want along the river, it won't matter because the pollution flows into the stream or the ditch and hits it. So it's more land and more money than you might think at first. Not a bad idea, but it's a little more complicated. The other thing is that as we are now seeing the dramatic increase in the frequency and intensity of major flood events in this state, there are bazillions of trees that watershed groups have planted up and down the rivers and streams of the state that have all been washed away by erosion events. We have to think more broadly about how we protect and think about river corridors. It's not just the buffer, because these rivers historically have moved, many hundreds of meters in different directions across valleys. So it's thinking more strategically about how to give those rivers room to move. But the concept of thinking in that way, about thinking about how to protect riparian zones and to make sure that there's the filtration that comes with natural vegetation, is a brilliant idea and one I think we should continue to invest in.
I would just offer that there are programs, and would be happy to provide you with additional information if you'd like to share it with your friends, particularly through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There's the Conservation Reserve Program, which works with farmers to take land out of production, to recognize the value of the land, and frankly to help plant trees and reestablish those kinds of good riparian habitats. David's point is well taken about the need to think about rivers as dynamic systems and not fixed in place, and recognize that they'll move over time. But another element of the importance of those riparian areas is their function as habitat. And we know that they serve as important animal travel corridors and provide important in-stream benefits too. So there's a lot of different pieces out there and a lot of opportunities for wins for the natural environment.
I'm sorry to just interject, and we think about flood resilience, protection against floods. Our communities downstream are much better protected when we restore and maintain those riparian zones, the floodplains and wetland features. Habitat's great, but it also protects our businesses and our homes.
I would just put a plug in also for civic participation. People should go to Agency of Agriculture regulatory hearings and stand up for the waterways, because we just fought through a process after Act 64 of developing new required agricultural practices for all the agricultural operations in the state. And I can tell you that two of the hottest button items were mandatory buffer zones and non-cropped buffer zones, and fencing cows out of streams. And we're still at that point. We're at that point with the Agency of Agriculture where it wasn't even a clear path in that recent set of regulations to get those minimum level requirements And not to be discouraging, but I think that means that more folks need to go to the inconvenient hearings that the Agency of Agriculture schedules and stand up for our waterways and talk about why we need these things in place.
We have time for 2 more questions. So Tom and then Joanna. I think you wanted to. Oh, thank you.
Hi, Tom Berry with Senator Leahy's office. To some extent, there's a message out there that somehow the federal government's left the playing field. And I'd point out, but then put it in the form of a question, that, in fact, this year there's probably more federal money available for work on Lake Champlain and water quality than certainly in time. I've been at it quite as long as Chris, but in the last 25 years at least. And although the administration is pushing back as hard as they can in the opposite direction with a big lift from Congressman Welch, and he's represented here tonight, and Senator Leahy, we're looking at probably in FY18 again having record federal dollars, but everything we've heard tonight, it's not enough, not nearly enough, and then there's the whole regulatory side of the scene as well. So, at risk of taking home some homework, what more can or should the federal government be doing in this?
Can I jump in on that one? Because that's easy. The biggest thing right now, the thing that terrifies me the most, is that the single most hated federal agency in the U.S. right now is the Environmental Protection Agency. They need our support right now. We have no idea in this state how much we depend upon the expertise and the resources that EPA brings. They're so maligned, but they are being gutted right now. Even without the current federal budget going through, they're being gutted by the current administrator. We need to step up and stand up for that agency. We depend upon their expertise, their resources, and their support. And the implementation of the Clean Water Act to get this job done. So that would be, if I had any one thing to say, it would be that our delegation really stand up for EPA and to resist any effort to cut them. And I don't mean just the funding that flows through them to the states, which is critical to Secretary Moore, but I mean the money that flows to the staff and the experts and the scientists in that agency. They are much maligned, and I think it's a grave error for this country to move in a different direction with that agency.
I hate to be a one-trick pony, but the regulatory drivers and backstops, which have been in the Federal Clean Water Act for decades. I did an argument this week in a Clean Water Act set of lawsuits at the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. And after the argument on my trip home, I was struck as a student of the Clean Water Act, maybe idealistic in the 80s, wanting to go to law school and work, do the kind of work that I'm doing. At that point, it was the passage of the Clean Water Act was still relatively recent history. And the 1987 amendments had just passed, and there was clear resolve, bipartisan resolve, around the idea. A lot of people don't realize, and this is just a good example, the Clean Water Act set as a national goal to eliminate the use of the nation's waters for disposal of waste by 1983. Not like reduce it and permit it and put some bells and whistles on it. Eliminate. That's what Congress said in 1972.
And a
bipartisan group overrode President Nixon's veto to pass that law, led by Vermont Senator Stafford in great part on the Republican side. And I feel that public understanding has been lost in the shuffle by the relentless messaging of industry and industrial progress and commercial progress as articulated through, I would say, self-interested messaging machines. We need to balance. We need to balance, even to the point where we've abandoned environmental justice communities and basically said as a solution for them, we're just not going to really enforce the law, which is basically saying you can just live with your pollution. You can have dirty water, you can have sick kids, and you can have toxic chemicals because we're going to take it easy on you. That's a terrible posture. And we need to see, and I know meeting with you, Tom, and your colleagues in all of our congressional delegations' offices, we have maybe the most amazing delegation on these issues across the board of any state in the nation, and I can't say thank you enough. You know this, and Senator Leahy certainly has been a national leader for decades on it. But as David is saying, defend EPA, but let's get back to clean water and clean air as nonpartisan issues that benefit all Americans and deserve to be funded, and where industries that foul those public resources can reasonably be held accountable. In 1963, the Vermont Supreme Court found that it is entirely reasonable for one who's causing pollution to be held to account for their share of that pollution problem. In Vermont, Woolen versus Wackerman, the first great articulation of the polluter pays principle in Vermont. And it should still be true today. We shouldn't be saying, well, we have to bail out all these big parking lots because, gee whiz, it's complicated and it's hard. No, let's just start exercising the authority we have and setting reasonable schedules for people to retrofit their parking lots and protect our waterways under the Clean Water Act. That can happen tomorrow if Secretary Moore convinces her colleagues and the governor the authority is there. We can do it.
Thank you, Julie.
I would just add a second to David's plea for support for the EPA. They are an incredible partner, not only on our water work, but our air work, our solid waste work, our work to address hazardous sites and clean them up and remediate them. The other piece on the federal level that we're paying careful attention to is the Farm Bill, and that's up for renewal next year, and in particular the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which allows us to do things like wetland restoration projects, the riparian buffer plantings through the Conservation Reserve Program, in addition to the base federal funding for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And their support to the Ag Agency is similar to EPA's support of my agency. And both of our work is far better and frankly only gets done because of those partnerships.
Can I add one other thing? Dedicated federal funding to get our wastewater treatment plants to less than 0.1 phosphorus. Let's just solve that problem. Let's dissolve phosphorus. The Lake Erie studies that are going on right now show that dissolved phosphorus that those plants emit is far more of a daily driver on cyanobacteria outbreaks than anything that's coming down our rivers on sediment from farms. Let's just take care of it. We have the technology. We can do it. Let's put a program in place. 10 years, all wastewater treatment plants in the Lake Champlain Basin are getting 0.1 or better, and then we can just grow.
Hi, Joanna Cummings. My early career, I farmed and practiced horticulture, and for a period of time also worked at what's now the Agency of Ag, but it was the Department of Ag at the time. So there were more farms back then. It wasn't that long ago, but there were more farms than there are now. But there were only 4 employees for the Department of Ag who were responsible for going and covering the entire state and working with dairy farmers on all of the regulations that they had to follow, plus what they were supposed to voluntarily follow, which was nutrient and best management practices. And over time, extension services have been cut. So farmers have, in a lot of cases, relied on commercial feed and agriculture fertilizer salespersons to get their recommendations for how to manage their crops. And so, of course, people are going to want to sell more products, so they're going to, in many cases, recommend applying more fertilizer. So what I would like to say, and you can answer this question or not, but I'm making a statement here, I would like to recommend that the Extension Service be beefed up, triple, quadruple, one person per county at least, to be able to deal with all these things that you're going to be asking them to do, especially when the regulations happen. I worked in state government for long enough to know that a lot of people don't like hearing the state government telling you what to do. Extension's nonprofit. It's more of a, we're here to help, and I think that's a more receptive type of advice that you could give, but with only one person in the whole state to cover forage crop production, there should be one person at least in each county helping out farmers, more in the counties where there are more farmers, to be able to help them, especially make this transition. So hire 50 people, really, 100 people, however many it takes. But we're dealing with people who you're saying have to change. And you're not going to help them change by posting a bunch of stuff on a website. It needs to be person-to-person interaction, especially in the farm community. So I would recommend the first thing that you do is to hire a lot more people that specialize in what you're going to be asking farmers to do and help them to get it done. Thanks.
Thank you. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say, I think one of the greatest successes the agency has had is a collaboration with the Lake Champlain Basin Program and UVM Extension to hire a series of agronomists. We call it the ACAP. I'm not going to remember what the acronym stands for. But essentially, it hired between 1 and 2 positions in St. Albans, Middlebury, and down in the Poultney Meadowy. So the entire length of the Champlain Basin. Extension was able to turn around and leverage that investment of dollars into doubling, tripling, and I think in one case, quadrupling the number of staff that they brought on to do exactly the type of work you're talking about, Joanna, trying to get individuals out on farms, building relationships. We recognize that the feed and seed dealers are frankly the guys who show up on farms, and they build those relationships and they build that trust and end up in that position of you're right, a little bit of a fox guarding the hen house and developing the nutrient management plans. I would say the dramatic growth and extension over the last 5 to 8 years has been really important in doing demonstrations of different types of innovative projects. Farmers, I think, have adopted many of those projects as a result of the opportunity to see those demonstrations. There are innumerable crop and field days that are now run, way, way more than there were 10 years ago before that program came into existence. And I think it's one of the rays of light in a service delivery model, and the ability to go out, work one-on-one with farmers and devise solutions that address water quality concerns, improve their bottom line, and achieve collectively our goals.
I agree with the comment and with what Secretary Moore said. I just add a couple of things, a couple of points of information. One is, in addition to extension, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board has a farm viability program that I think we need to continue to invest and grow in. That's a program that sends consultants out to work with farmers to help them become economically successful and to learn how to diversify and expand their operations in ways that protect the environment and help them be successful. I also think increasing farmers' access to low interest capital is critical, and I think the land trust community being involved in buying conservation development rights and putting land into conservation is also a critical piece of the puzzle with farms. All of these things are ways in which we can help achieve the transition that Chris appropriately identified as the biggest challenge we face with agriculture.
Thank you. No? Okay, I think, Teresa?
Are we allowed to say like anything in closing, or is this the end of it?
How's everybody feel?
David's running for governor.
No, I kind of came prepared with my clean water report notebook, and we really haven't talked about clean water funding, so we don't have time to get into the details.
Well, actually, I think it would be great. We did not talk about funding, and I think it would be great if you want to discuss that now. You know, how should the state come up with this $25 million a year?
This is the cover to a report. I'm like Johnny Carson with, zoom in on this report. This is a report prepared by Treasurer Beth Pierce with the support of the Agency of Natural Resources and Agency of Ag and Commerce and a variety of others. It's a terrific report. It lays out a roadmap for how we can raise the funding. She recommends essentially that we use impact fees as a way of complementing the existing sources of funding that we already have coming from state coffers. And that's what I think we should do. I think our state legislature needs to adopt an impact fee that's tied to the amount of impervious surface that we have across the landscape. And there's ways to do it. As Secretary Moore indicates, there's challenges, there's inefficiencies. We haven't done it yet. It's complicated. But in Vermont, we have a history of rolling up our sleeves and getting the job done. It's not that complicated to raise $25 million. And I promise, it's not complicated to spend it. I could gather a group, blindfold me, give me a dart, and I'll throw it on a map, hit a watershed in the state of Vermont. I would be able to, within 15 minutes, identify an A&R tactical basin planner, the watershed group, the conservation district, the local municipal conservation district folks, we could identify 10 projects that would be priority projects that would make a real difference and spend $25 million in 15 minutes. So we need our legislature to create this source of funding. It's not the whole solution, but it's an important keystone part of what we need to do next. And it's a key part of the promise that the state legislature made to citizens of Vermont, and not, incidentally to EPA, that we would meet our obligations under the Clean Water Act to drive this lake and the waterways across the state to a cleaner state. We need funding, we need a dedicated source. Treasurer Pierce's report lays the groundwork for our legislature to act. We should do that.
So do we have the political will to do that?
We had the political will, bipartisan, to pass a far-reaching, maybe not far-reaching enough. It represented the kind of compromise that comes out of democratic process. But in 2015, we passed with a strong tripartisan majority Act 64. And a part of the promise was to deliver on this funding. So the political will was there 2 years ago or 3 years ago in the session. It should still be there, but the political will is in this room. If we need to translate from what's in this room and to the viewers that are on the screen to our state legislature, and they don't need to wait. I'm with Chris Killian. We can act now.
Thank you. Julie? How are we going to pay for it? Since the Scott administration made no recommendations for raising money, how do you plan to raise money?
Well, so currently we are paying for it, and we're paying for it with existing revenues. We use the capital bill. There is the Clean Water Fund, which is a small increment on the property transfer tax. We're paying for it with general fund, and we're paying for it with permit fees. And we know that some of those sources are sustainable and long-term, but the capital bill isn't. That the capital bill has a lot of different demands placed on it, and that ultimately we need to wean ourselves off the capital bill. I don't disagree with David that looking at a parcel or an impervious surface fee seems like the most logical step forward. But I think it has to be efficient and effective. And if we can't collect it efficiently, then it's not the right mechanism. We admittedly only looked at 2 different strategies for doing that collection, but neither of them panned out. And so my hope is the legislature will take seriously both the work we did and the next steps that need to be done in that evaluation and come to an answer as to whether or not that's a viable source going forward this session.
I want to start by, or maybe finish the night here by thanking the governor for his support for the substantial increases in funding, and Julie, Secretary Moore, as a leader in that last year. And there were a lot of eyes on how that might play out, and a lot of concern, not knowing whether Governor Scott would continue on that path. And we were very pleased with the outcome last year, which really covered 2 fiscal years. So there's a little bit of at least relief going into this year that we already have some commitments in place that will continue an increase in funding. I personally have been very troubled by the messaging around the capital bill of late, and we've seen various leaders talk about how this isn't a sustainable approach to fund some of these things through the capital bill. There's nothing more fundamental to community sustainability and protecting our waters than the infrastructure that we put in place to provide water and wastewater services to our communities. And that has been a capital bill component forever, and it should still be. Clean water is at the heart of what we pay for through capital projects in our budgets on an annual basis, and we will make that case moving forward. And it's not maybe an ultimate panacea, but it hopefully will remain a very active dialogue and critical component. And in part, I say that because of the uncertainty in the debate about the next level funding. And I don't want to see retrenchment from the gains that we made, and the governor's support in that was critical, as was the support of many legislative leaders and legislators writ large. But the last point, again, one trick pony, I am a believer in the regulated marketplace. The fact that we have embraced as a society the notion that we can ask private actors in the commercial sector to comply with reasonable rules to protect the public interest. And anybody who wants to just say command and control, blah, 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 that model has worked. It has had great successes, and if we reinvest in it and we ask people that are in for-profit industries to do reasonable things and we hold them accountable to reasonable standards and give them certainty, that's fair. And it's fair to those that are doing the right thing, especially. Because we don't want to have a system where you get an economic benefit by degrading the environment where your competitors are not. And so particularly in the stormwater sector, as well as from my perspective in the agricultural sector, that's fair and appropriate. And those industries, when asked to meet those rules, will find the most efficient and economically straightforward ways of solving those problems, because then it's in their interest. But right now, we're not asking them to, and we're providing safe harbors, and we're allowing those costs to show up on the backs of the public in closed beaches and degraded waters, and that should not continue.
Thank you.
So, we're going to canvass the audience. How many of you learned something tonight? We told you that you would. So you have helped us fulfill a cornerstone of our mission tonight, which was engaging in civic discourse. And those of you at home watching Facebook Live, I hope you raised your hands too, because I certainly learned something tonight. This was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming out. If you appreciated what you heard tonight, if you learned something, support local journalism. Thank you very much. And you can watch this on our site. You can watch it at RTN's site. They'll be broadcasting it. If you sign up with them tonight, they'll send you the link, and you can watch it as many times as you would like. Thank you very much for coming out. And thank you, John Kalaki in the back, outgoing executive director of the Flynn. After years of service, thanks for the spot.